The Pacific Ocean had already swallowed thousands of ships before this moment. Steel hulls lay scattered across the seabed, torn apart by torpedoes, bombs, and firestorms. Sailors believed they understood how naval warfare worked. Distance mattered, armor mattered, experience mattered. Then, without warning, an American battleship fired a single shot that erased all of it. A shell weighing more than a truck crossed miles of open ocean and struck with such force that a modern warship ceased to exist as one object. This wasn't a battle. It was a realization. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to No Man's Land for unapologetic military history. Stories of steel, fire, and the moments that reshaped the world forever. Long before the Iowa ever fired a gun, the Pacific Ocean had become a graveyard. Beneath its surface lay the twisted remains of cruisers, destroyers, carriers, and transports, each one a testament to how brutal naval warfare had already become. Torpedoes had ripped hulls open. Bombs had peeled decks apart. Entire crews had vanished in seconds. By the time Iowa entered the theater, sailors on both sides believed they had seen the worst the sea could offer. The Japanese Navy, in particular, was no stranger to destruction. Its cruisers were modern, fast, and heavily armed, designed to fight in the kind of surface engagements naval officers had trained for decades to master. These ships were meant to trade fire with equals, absorb punishment, maneuver skillfully, and survive long enough for damage control to make the difference. Their crews drilled endlessly for air attacks, torpedo strikes, and night battles fought at knife-edge distances. What they were not prepared for was something far more final. Naval doctrine still rested on old assumptions. Ships would see each other. They would close distance. Armor would matter. Battles would unfold over time, not moments. Even in defeat, there was an expectation of struggle, of minutes, sometimes hours, between first contact and destruction. That belief was about to be shattered. Because the Pacific was no longer just a battlefield of ships and sailors, it had become a proving ground for industrial power, mathematics, and weapons so violent they ignored tradition entirely. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a ship was approaching that didn't intend to fight by the old rules. It didn't care about parity, honor, or exchange. It was built to decide outcomes before the enemy understood they were part of one. And when it finally spoke, the ocean itself would seem to recoil. The USS Iowa was not built to participate in naval warfare as it had always existed. She was built to replace it. Every major navy in the world believed there were trade-offs that could not be avoided. A ship could be heavily armored, or it could be fast. It could carry massive guns, or it could maneuver. Power demanded sacrifice. Iowa proved that assumption wrong. Stretching more than 860 feet from bow to stern, Iowa was nearly the length of 3 football fields laid end to end. But size alone wasn't what made her dangerous. It was how that size was used. 8 massive boilers fed 4 steam turbines, producing over 200,000 horsepower and driving the ship past 33 knots. That speed was unheard of for a battleship. It meant Iowa could outrun cruisers, reposition at will, and dictate the terms of any engagement she entered. To Japanese planners, this was deeply unsettling. Battleships were supposed to be slow, predictable. Iowa was neither. Her armor was equally deceptive. Thick belts of steel protected vital spaces, but the real strength was in her internal layout, compartmentalization, and survivability. She was designed to absorb punishment without losing fighting capability, allowing her to stay in the fight long after other ships would have been crippled. But all of that was meaningless until her guns fired. Iowa's existence alone disrupted enemy calculations. She didn't need to announce herself. Her speed allowed her to appear where she wasn't expected, and her range meant she could strike before the enemy realized she was even present. This wasn't a ship that reacted to battle. It initiated it. Naval warfare had always been about matching strength against strength. Iowa didn't believe in matches. She believed in overmatch. And somewhere beyond the curvature of the sea, crews aboard enemy ships were about to learn what that meant. At the center of the Iowa's power was not her speed or her armor. It was her guns. 9 Mark 7 16-inch naval rifles, arranged in 3 massive turrets, each one weighing more than many destroyers. These weren't simply weapons. They were the physical expression of American industrial force turned into artillery. Each gun could fire a projectile weighing nearly 2,700 pounds, a steel cylinder longer than a man is tall, packed with destructive potential that defied intuition. When one of these shells left the barrel, it didn't arc gently toward its target. It was hurled forward at over 2,500 feet per second, carrying enough kinetic energy to overwhelm steel through velocity alone. Explosives were almost secondary. Physics did most of the work. Armor-piercing rounds weren't designed to explode on contact. They were built to penetrate, delay, and then detonate deep inside a ship's structure. Against cruiser armor meant to stop 8-inch shells, the effect was catastrophic. Bulkheads failed, structural members sheared. Shockwaves traveled through hulls like earthquakes, snapping rivets and tearing seams apart from the inside out. For sailors on the receiving end, there was no gradual escalation, no warning exchange of fire, no time to adapt. One moment, the ship was intact. The next, it wasn't. The sound alone was terrifying. Crews miles away described the blast as thunder tearing the air open. Inside the turret, the recoil shoved thousands of tons of steel backward with enough force to rattle the entire ship. Outside, the ocean flinched as pressure waves rippled across the surface. These weren't shells in the traditional sense. They were declarations. Each round represented the conclusion of an equation that ended the same way every time. If a Mark 7 shell arrived, something was going to stop existing in its previous form. Naval warfare had never encountered a weapon like this deployed with precision. And soon, a Japanese ship would learn that lesson in the most unforgiving way imaginable. The Iowa's guns were terrifying, but what truly made them unfair was not their size. It was how they were aimed. Naval warfare had always depended on sight. Spotters, rangefinders, clear weather, and steady seas. If you couldn't see your enemy, you couldn't kill them. Iowa erased that limitation entirely. American radar and fire control systems gave the battleship something no Japanese cruiser possessed: foresight. Long before enemy crews knew they were being hunted, Iowa's operators had already locked onto them electronically. Radar pulses reached out across the darkness, bouncing back information about range, speed, and bearing with unnerving accuracy. Inside Iowa's plotting rooms, analog fire control computers transformed that data into firing solutions in seconds. Wind, roll, pitch, shell type, target movement, even barrel wear were calculated automatically. The guns weren't aimed at where the enemy was. They were aimed at where the enemy would be. Japanese crews still relied heavily on optics and manual calculations, methods that demanded visibility and time. At night, in smoke, or in rough seas, those systems faltered. Iowa's did not. Darkness became an advantage instead of an obstacle. This technological gap turned combat into something deeply asymmetrical. A Japanese ship could maneuver, zigzag, accelerate, or slow, believing those actions bought safety. Iowa's systems anticipated every move. Evasion became irrelevant. By the time visual contact was even possible, the battle was already over. The guns were loaded. The solutions were set. The turrets were aligned with targets that hadn't yet realized they were condemned. This wasn't gunnery in the traditional sense. It was predictive execution. A warship reaching into the future and pulling destruction back into the present. When the order to fire finally came, it wasn't a gamble. It was the final step of a calculation already solved. The first shell did not announce itself with spectacle. There was no warning flare, no dramatic exchange of fire, no heroic buildup. One moment, the Japanese cruiser was maneuvering as trained, confident in distance and armor. The next, physics arrived. The Mark 7 shell did not strike the hull and explode outward. It penetrated. Armor plate designed to resist cruiser-caliber fire offered no meaningful resistance. Steel that had once been a shield became a conduit for force. The shell drove deep into the ship before detonating, releasing its energy where the vessel was weakest, inside. What followed was not an explosion so much as a failure. Structural members buckled in sequence. Bulkheads collapsed. The keel, the spine of the ship, lost integrity. Shockwaves traveled through compartments faster than sound, snapping rivets and tearing seams apart far from the point of impact. Men were thrown to the deck without understanding why. For a brief moment, the cruiser remained afloat. Then the hull began to deform in ways ships are never meant to. The bow lifted unnaturally. The stern sagged. Water rushed through wounds that damage control teams could not reach, let alone contain. The ship didn't sink as a single object. It separated. Bow and stern drifted apart, each half carrying sailors who now understood they were standing on wreckage, not a warship. There was no time to react, no counterfire, no second chance. Less than a minute after impact, the cruiser no longer existed in any meaningful sense. From a distance, observers struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. Ships were damaged, burned, flooded, even capsized, but they were not supposed to break in half from a single hit. Doctrine offered no explanation. Experience offered no comfort. In that moment, the Japanese Navy didn't just lose a ship. It lost certainty. Because if one shell could do this, then nothing they had built was safe. And the Iowa hadn't fired a full salvo. The destruction of the cruiser didn't end with the sinking. It spread outward, carried by radio waves, eyewitness reports, and disbelief. Japanese operators hesitated before transmitting what they had seen. There was no standard language for a ship being erased by a single shell. Messages were rewritten, softened, questioned. Commanders demanded confirmation. Engineers suggested secondary explosions. Pride refused to accept the truth. But the truth refused to disappear. Across the task force, captains altered course without orders. Destroyers widened their spacing. Cruisers adjusted speed, believing distance might offer protection. It didn't. The ocean suddenly felt smaller, tighter, hostile in ways no chart could explain. Every radar contact became a potential death sentence. What terrified crews most was not the violence of the hit, but its efficiency. There had been no prolonged exchange, no chance to respond. One moment, the ship was alive. The next, it wasn't. Naval warfare was supposed to involve decisions. This had felt like inevitability. Rumors began circulating faster than facts. Some sailors claimed the Americans had developed guided shells. Others believed Iowa carried a new explosive unknown to Japan. A few whispered that no conventional armor could stop what they had witnessed. When technology outruns understanding, fear fills the gaps. Commanders reviewed doctrine in real time. recalculating assumptions that had guided naval planning for decades. What do you do when armor doesn't matter? How do you evade a weapon that arrives before you can react? There were no satisfying answers. Meanwhile, Iowa did not pursue theatrics. Her crew reloaded methodically, recalculated firing solutions, and tracked every remaining contact with calm precision. There was no celebration aboard the battleship, only focus. They understood something the enemy now feared. This was not an anomaly. It was repeatable. The loss of the cruiser wasn't just a tactical blow. It was psychological trauma inflicted at fleet level. Ships are made of steel, but navies are made of men. And in those men, something fundamental had cracked. The Pacific had not become deadlier. It had become unfair. For decades, naval architects believed armor was the final answer. Thicker belts, angled plating, reinforced decks, survival through steel. Japanese warships embodied that philosophy. Their cruisers were layered with protection designed to defeat anything in their class. Against traditional naval guns, it worked. Against Iowa, it was irrelevant. The Mark VII didn't fight armor head-on. It exploited it. At long range, Iowa's shells descended at steep angles, plunging downward onto decks never meant to absorb that kind of force. Armor belts were thick, but deck armor was thinner, stitched together by welds and seams that became points of failure under extreme stress. When the shell struck, it didn't need a perfect angle. Velocity compensated for everything. Steel deformed. Internal shockwaves rippled through compartments like seismic tremors, collapsing bulkheads far from the impact point. Damage didn't stay localized, it cascaded. This was the nightmare Japanese engineers had never planned for. Armor that couldn't stop penetration didn't just fail, it amplified destruction. The energy had nowhere to go except through the ship itself. Naval doctrine had promised that even a hit could be survived. Damage control teams would respond. Compartments would be sealed. The ship would fight on. That logic depended on time. Iowa removed time from the equation. A ship hit by a Mark VII shell didn't enter a damage control scenario. It entered a structural failure scenario. Crews weren't racing to save their vessel. They were struggling to understand why it was already lost. The realization spread quickly among Japanese commanders. Bigger ships didn't mean safer ships. Thicker armor didn't guarantee survival. In fact, it might make things worse. The foundations of naval design were cracking under the weight of a single truth. Protection no longer equaled survivability. Iowa had not just defeated a ship. She had invalidated an entire philosophy of warship construction. And if armor no longer mattered, then nothing the Japanese fleet relied on could be trusted. The ocean hadn't changed. The rules had. The true damage Iowa inflicted could not be measured in tonnage or wreckage. It unfolded quietly, inside command rooms and behind officers' eyes. What Iowa destroyed was not just a cruiser, but the belief system that held an entire navy together. For generations, Japanese naval doctrine revolved around the decisive battle. Two fleets would meet. Skill, courage, and preparation would determine the outcome. Victory was supposed to be earned through maneuver, timing, and sacrifice. Iowa shattered that premise in minutes. There had been no duel, no exchange, no test of seamanship. The cruiser never truly fought. It was selected, calculated, and erased. That distinction mattered. It meant war had shifted from contest to calculation. After the engagement, Japanese formations changed. Ships increased spacing, believing separation might reduce losses. Captains maneuvered more cautiously, avoiding aggressive positioning. Destroyers hesitated to screen capital ships too closely. Every adjustment was driven by fear of a weapon they could not see and could not counter. Strategists reviewed engagement reports and found no tactical error to correct. The cruiser had not made a mistake. It had simply existed within range of something vastly superior. That realization was far more damaging than any single loss. You can fix mistakes. You cannot fix inevitability. What haunted Japanese planners most was restraint. Iowa had not fired a full broadside. She had not pressed the advantage recklessly. She had demonstrated capability, then waited. That suggested confidence bordering on certainty. The implication was clear. This was not maximum force. This was a warning. Naval warfare had always allowed room for hope, a chance that better positioning, better timing, or better luck might change the outcome. Iowa removed that space. When outcomes become predictable, morale collapses. From that moment forward, Japanese commanders did not ask how to defeat Iowa. They asked how long they could survive knowing she might be nearby. The engagement had ended. The psychological war had just begun. When the smoke thinned and the Pacific settled back into its unnatural calm, the meaning of what had happened became impossible to ignore. This was not just a battle reviewed in after-action reports. It was a verdict delivered to every Navy still clinging to old assumptions. The Iowa had not revealed a weakness in Japanese tactics. She had exposed the future arriving ahead of schedule. In Tokyo, analysts studied fragmented reports with quiet urgency. They examined armor thickness, shell weights, engagement distances, and firing arcs, searching for reassurance that did not exist. The Yamato-class battleships, once believed untouchable, suddenly felt vulnerable. Bigger guns no longer guaranteed dominance. Heavier armor no longer promised survival. Velocity, computation, and reach had rewritten the hierarchy of power. What disturbed planners most was not what Iowa had done, but what she had not needed to do. She had not closed distance. She had not traded salvos. She had not revealed her full capability. The destruction of the cruiser had occurred while Iowa was operating well within her limits. That implication lingered like poison. If this was restraint, what did full commitment look like? Across the Pacific, enemy ships now sailed with an invisible burden. Every horizon concealed possibility. Every radar contact carried dread. Sailors did not fear battle anymore. They feared mathematics. They feared being chosen by a system that did not miss. And yet, aboard the Iowa, there was no celebration. Her crew understood the gravity of what they had unleashed. A weapon that ends arguments does not invite pride. It demands responsibility. The guns cooled. The radar continued sweeping. The battleship moved on, unchanged, unchallenged. The Iowa was never meant to symbolize glory. She symbolized conclusion, an answer to a question every Navy had asked for centuries. What happens when preparation, industry, and precision converge perfectly? The answer lay beneath the waves. The Pacific did not forget that day. Neither did those who sailed it afterward, because long after the wreckage sank, the lesson remained unmistakable. Naval warfare was no longer a contest of courage. It was a calculation, and the Iowa always solved it first. Always solved it first. Always solved it first.